If I had a nickel for every brother who goes missing in this story, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's tragic that it happened twice. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Line. Wasilla, Alaska is the 49th state's 4th largest city, but in America's least densely populated state, that doesn't mean all that much. With a population of just over 9,000 as of the 2020 census, the little community 40 miles north of Anchorage would be considered relatively sleepy by many of us in the lower 48. And yet, it's home to one of the most bizarre missing persons incidents in recent memory. Back in 1999, a teenager named Michael Palmer disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a bike and a pair of soaking wet shoes. Nobody could say for certain why, when, or how he vanished, and that would be weird in and of itself given the circumstances, but it was what happened 11 years later that firmly places this story in the bizarre category. Michael was one of 3 boys in the Palmer family, and the youngest by about 7 years. His middle brother, Chuck, was born in 1990, and Chris a couple of years before that. It seems that the boys were always close, but that they didn't necessarily share hobbies. For instance, Chris was an experienced snowmobiler, while Chuck had just purchased his first machine when the 2 remaining brothers headed out to Talkeetna for a weekend trip in 2010. Chris had planned to show his younger brother the ropes one Saturday in April, together with their stepfather and 2 friends, but on the way out to their cabin, he suffered a mechanical issue and was unable to go out with the rest of the crew. Not willing to spoil the fun for everyone, he stayed back to work on repairs, while the rest of them hit the trails near Bald Mountain. By the end of the day, Chris would be the only remaining Palmer brother, and nobody could explain what had happened to Chuck when they returned to the cabin that night. Like his younger brother, the middle child left behind only the object he was last seen riding, leaving family, friends, and neighbors to wonder if the Palmer family was unlucky, cursed, or targeted. And speaking of being targeted, have you ever noticed that your apps and browsers seem to know a little bit too much about you? While that can be convenient for serving you the kind of content you want to see, events that are local to you, and ads that you might find relevant, the fact is that the same data these platforms use to show you all of those things can also be bought and sold by data brokers. Anytime you sign up for a free trial or fill out a survey, for example, there's a chance that the information you shared, like your name, phone number, and even your home address, could end up listed somewhere online to be purchased by scammers, stalkers, and all sorts of other villains. That's why we've partnered with Delete Me, a subscription data management service which finds the data you want kept private and files takedown notices on your behalf. You give them the information you want taken offline, and their team handles the rest, no matter how many times your data pops up again. With over 100 million pieces of data removed for their customers, Delete Me's got a proven track record of getting the job done. If you're ready to take control of your digital footprint, head over to joindeleteme.com/lorelodge or click the link in the description to get started with a 20% discount using code LORELODGE today. Again, that is joindeleteme.com/lorelodge or click the link in the description for a 20% discount using code LORELODGE. It was just after 12:30 a.m. on Friday, June 4th, 1999, when Lisa Palmer arrived home from her shift at Providence, Alaska Medical Center. She was exhausted from the long hours at the hospital, but before she could go to bed, she needed to be sure that all of her kids were accounted for. One of those children, her youngest son, 15-year-old Michael Palmer, was out of the house at a sleepover hosted by his friends Dustin and Tommy. But a quick phone call to their mother confirmed what she expected to be the case. The boys were all fast asleep in a clubhouse in the backyard. With that peace of mind secured, Lisa laid down and went to sleep. When she awoke the next morning, she wasn't expecting Michael to be home quite yet, but as that long Alaskan summer day meandered its way towards noon without even so much as a phone call, she began to grow anxious. While her son staying over at a friend's house wasn't out of the ordinary, him not calling home to let his mother know his plans was, and Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Seeking to put her worries to rest before she went in for her next shift, she called over to Dustin and Tommy's house, hoping for confirmation that Michael and the other boys had simply slept in. But when Dustin answered the phone, it wasn't with the news that Lisa was looking for. Not only was Michael not there, but as far as Dustin was aware, he'd ridden his bike home late that night, with his friends last seeing him around 4 o'clock in the morning. "I know you're lying," Lisa recalled saying. "What's going on? Where is he?" Dustin, for his part, had no answer. As far as he knew, or at least as far as he was willing to divulge, Michael, his brother Tommy, himself, and a friend named Cameron had snuck out to go to a graduation party at a Timmy Russell's house in the area of Pittman Road on the northwest outskirts of Wasilla. An assuredly bashful Dustin explained that they'd all had a few beers before starting the ride home, and that they'd been on their way back to he and his brother's house near Park Highway mile marker 51 when they lost track of Michael. According to Lisa, the teenager told her that when her son never caught up to them, they assumed he'd decided to go back to his own house for the night, and they had no idea where he might be. Lisa sprung into action, alerting the police about Michael's disappearance by 3 o'clock that afternoon. At first, troopers tried to convince her that he was probably just off drinking somewhere, but Lisa was adamant that something wasn't right, and they relented to a mother's intuition and began to organize a search effort. Meanwhile, Michael's brothers and father got to work on their own search. Charles Palmer IV had been on a fishing trip when one of his older sons, Chuck, also known as Charles Palmer V, called him about Michael's disappearance. He hurried home, and the Palmer men set about on four-wheelers in the area where their youngest boy was last seen, though nothing came of their first afternoon on the hunt. The same was not true of day 2, Saturday the 5th. State troopers were flying over Michael's last known position when they spied something metallic half-submerged in the Little Susitna River. Ground teams rushed to the location, where they pulled a bicycle from the water, about half a mile north of where Dustin had said they last saw Michael. Papers identified the bike as being the one that the missing teen was riding, and questions quickly arose about the possibility that he had drowned. Divers were in the water the very next morning, while dog teams unsuccessfully attempted to locate a scent along the riverbanks. Now, this was a sensible place to look, but at the same time, searchers doubted that Michael was still in the river for a number of reasons. Not only was the water in that section of the stream shallow and narrow enough to wade across, and clear enough to see through to the bottom, but there was also a log jam 200 yards downriver. So investigators felt it unlikely that Michael, even if he were dead or unconscious, could have been swept beyond that obstruction. As the search progressed, new evidence seemed to support that conclusion after a pair of Converse sneakers matching the size and style Michael had been wearing that night turned up in a bizarre location later that same day. The exact details were a little hard to confirm, but what can be said for certain is that Michael's sneakers turned up on a private airstrip just a few hundred yards north of where his bike was found in the river. Contemporary sources said nothing about how searchers came upon the shoes, but one local source, the Matsu Frontiersman, reported in 2002 that a pair of Michael's black athletic shoes were recovered when another teenager, whose father owned the airstrip, gave them to investigators. And that was a detail confirmed in the Anchorage Daily News in June of 2000. As if that weren't strange enough, state police spokesman Greg Wilkinson told the Anchorage Daily News that the shoes were wet, one was untied, and they were sitting next to each other as if Palmer had set them aside. And on top of that, a later article on the first anniversary of the disappearance noted that the shoes were covered in silt when found. The lack of a body in the river, the log jams, the bike, and the wet shoes pointed away from the possibility that Michael had drowned, but beyond that, they only served to complicate the case further. Based on the reporting from the time, it seems that the four teenagers had been at a party on Pittman Road, somewhere to the east of where the other three last saw Michael at the intersection of Pittman and Silver. Troopers were able to gather a few further details about that night from Dustin and Tommy, who reportedly said that the boy Palmer was riding with sped ahead to catch up with the other two boys in the group. When Palmer failed to catch up with them, the Anchorage Daily News continued, the three boys stopped about 3 miles away and waited about 40 minutes. But when he didn't turn up, they assumed Palmer had gone to his home, which is on the way. And that detail tells us that the Palmers lived south of the river, so there was no reason for Michael to try and cross it if he was trying to get home. It leaves the question, what drove him to go north? If the troopers ever suspected that the other boys might have had something to do with Michael's disappearance, they never openly said as much, nor did they immediately seek to open a criminal investigation. They did, however, shift their focus towards other angles of investigation, as the trail had gone completely cold after searches through the surrounding forest turned up no sign of the missing teenager. And while Michael's mother told the Anchorage Daily News that she did not believe that her youngest son would have run away, her justifications for that assertion don't necessarily hold up. The paper reported that Lisa wanted people to know that her son was a good boy, one who has long abided by his mother's overprotective ways. According to her, she always demanded to know where he was, and he always called. Now, I don't want to speculate too much, but having been a 15-year-old boy whose parents could be a bit on the overbearing side, I can attest that it can become a little stifling to constantly alert them of your whereabouts as you get older. Potentially with that thought process in mind, the troopers set about reaching out to runaway shelters and friends of Michael's who lived outside of Wasilla. Back in town, investigators went door to door interviewing residents along Pittman Road, but due to the late hour of the disappearance, they found nobody who could recall seeing or hearing anything that night. Nobody could tell them anything which Dustin and Tommy hadn't already revealed, and dozens of interviews along with several polygraphs of people present at the party that night revealed nothing further. One witness told police that he or she had seen Michael leave a party with 2 other people in a blue sedan, but the people and the car had been at a different party entirely. Rumors came and went, many of them suggesting there had been a fight at the party, which resulted in something tragic happening to Michael, but investigators found these rumors to be baseless every single time. There was a brief spark of hope that the case might be solved when, the winter after Michael disappeared, Charles Palmer tracked down a teenager who his elder sons, Chris and Chuck, had heard was telling a detailed story about Michael being beaten and shot at a bridge far from the bicycle. Charles then dragged this kid into the station, where troopers interviewed him and administered a polygraph, at which point the story fell apart and its teller admitted he'd made the whole thing up. So everywhere investigators looked, it was a dead end. Looking back to the night of the disappearance, the troopers remained baffled by essentially every detail of the story. Investigator Leonard Wallner told the Anchorage Daily News that he spoke with several medical examiners in order to ascertain how far Michael could have gone had he fallen into the river that night and climbed out, though that still wouldn't explain why he'd gone that way in the first place, and the consensus was that he couldn't have gotten far. On the night Michael disappeared, temperatures had dipped down to 43 degrees Fahrenheit, or just over 6 degrees Celsius. Coupled with 17-mile-an-hour winds, they believed the chill would have brought the 5'4" tall, 110-pound teenager down within a quarter of a mile. Searchers had combed an area quite a bit larger than that, and they had found nothing. The police brought in as many resources as they could gather, but without firm evidence of foul play, those resources were limited. They were able to obtain help from 3 former law enforcement officials working with Project Alert, including former DEA, former Secret Service, and a detective out of Fairbanks, but those men ran up against the same walls as everybody else had so far. I think we're in the same dilemma that the troopers are, Ron Jones, the case manager for the Project Alert team, told the Anchorage Daily News in June of 2000. Of course, everyone's not straightforward. Something did go wrong that they're not telling. But what did he mean by that? It's a question very much worth asking, even 26 years on, and it's one for which Charles Palmer was determined to find an answer. With law enforcement stymied, Michael's father turned to private investigators. Now, very little has been published about their findings, but Charles told the Mat-Su frontiersman in 2006 that one of the PIs found out that Mike might never have left the party, and that the other had quit and even left town after receiving death threats. Charles himself left the state after his marriage to Lisa ended in divorce, and told the frontiersman that he did so because he knew if they started threatening me, it would be the last threat they ever made. Now, it is unclear if he knew who was making the threats to his private investigators, or why he seemed so concerned about that, because, I don't think anybody would blame him. But as for what Michael's friends had said about the night he disappeared, Charles felt like they were hiding something. Tommy, Dustin, and Cameron, he told the paper, that's a bullshit story what they said. I've been out there at 2, 3, and 4 a.m. and looked. There's no way they could have seen him. Why take off in the first place? Why leave him? Now, that passage in and of itself is confusing because the author neglected to explain the context of the statement, there's no way they could have seen him, but the 2 questions he asked, why take off in the first place and why leave him, are perfectly reasonable. And, in a bizarre twist of fate, the very same questions applied to the disappearance of Chuck Palmer when he vanished nearly 11 years after his younger brother in astonishingly similar circumstances. The last time anyone could recall seeing Chuck Palmer, he was heading the wrong direction on a snowmobile. On April 10th of 2010, the middle Palmer son was on a snowmobiling trip in the mountains east of Talkeetna, Alaska, with his elder brother Chris, their stepfather, and 2 other unnamed companions. Oddly enough, there's very little published information about what happened to Chuck, and most of that material is vague. What we do know is that the group of 5 men were staying in a cabin somewhere in the area of Bald Mountain, about 5 miles east of Mastodon Road between Talkeetna and Sheep River, and that Chris Palmer was not along for the ride that day due to an issue with the handlebars on his snowmobile. this being that they had apparently snapped off. This was the first big problem in the case of Chuck Palmer. "I'm usually the last rider out there to make sure nobody gets left behind," Chris told the Anchorage Daily News on April 15th, but on this occasion, it was Chuck in that position. Unlike his older brother, Chuck was not an experienced snowmobiler, and to make matters worse, he was on a brand new machine with which he was not yet perfectly familiar. So one or both of those factors could have contributed to the mistake he made around 7:15 p.m. on Saturday the 10th. The sources aren't particularly detailed, but the story told by the rest of the group generally suggests that they were heading back to the cabin for the night when they saw Palmer on his snow machine but headed the wrong direction. Though Chris held the opinion that it's more likely they simply ran too fast for Chucky to keep up. Either way, once the group realized that Chuck was gone, they searched through the night before reporting him missing first thing on Sunday morning. That same day, searchers found the first sign of Chuck's whereabouts when they located his snowmobile stuck in a drift near Sheep River about 12 miles away from the cabin. As with most of this story, specific details are hard to come by, and the fact that many sources refer to this as Sheep Creek instead of Sheep River only complicates the matter. Sheep Creek is south of the general area of the cabin, while Sheep River is to the east and north. One of the other problems with the facts in this story surrounds that cabin, because try as I might, I could not find one place that matches the given description. And while it's definitely possible that I just can't find it, it should be said that the papers could have misreported the cabin as being 5 miles east of Mastodon Road, when in reality they might have meant to say that Mastodon Road is 5 miles from the community of Talkeetna. There don't appear to be any roads that go 5 miles east of Mastodon Road, so unless they were bringing all of the supplies with them via snowmobile all the time, it would make sense if they were staying where they had reportedly parked. Whatever the case, the snowmobile was reportedly 12 miles from the cabin near Sheep River, which would put it somewhere on the eastern north side of Bald Mountain. It still had fuel, which led searchers to believe that Chuck had abandoned it after finding himself unable to dig it out. And that was a major concern because he had no survival equipment with him. He was dressed for the cold, sure, but he didn't have a GPS, food, water, or any of the gear you'd need to spend a few nights waiting for rescue in the Alaskan wilderness. Finding the snowmobile should have been the first step in tracking him down, but that too came with challenges, because even though he must have been there at some point, there were absolutely no tracks leading away from the vehicle. Something that the Anchorage Daily News reported was due to new snow which had fallen either overnight or on the first day of the search. The papers actually don't even mention which direction the snowmobile appeared to have been heading when it got stuck, which leaves me completely in the dark when combined with the total lack of details regarding where the cabin is. Another confusing aspect is the scenery in the area. While Alaska is a rugged place, this was a rather straightforward area to get out of by comparison. The Sheep River flows northwest out of a glacier in the Talkeetna Mountains until it reaches Bald Mountain, where it turns west, joins the Talkeetna River, and then flows right into Talkeetna itself. So assuming that Chuck was uninjured, and there was no evidence that he wasn't, all he needed to do was follow the water downstream and downhill. Hiking back through the snow below the mountain would have been an option as well, albeit much more difficult, but the mountain itself would have worked well enough as a landmark by which to guide his way. He'd just need to avoid falling through any of the frozen ponds along the way. And even if he couldn't make it all the way back, he could have at least made it to above the tree line, and thus been visible to the planes and helicopters flying overhead in search of him. That, among other things, is part of what makes Chuck's disappearance so bizarre. It's not necessarily how he got lost or that they couldn't find him, but that he had such a straightforward way of making it to safety, and yet he never turned up. And I don't mean to make it sound like carving your way through the Alaskan wilderness alongside of a river is necessarily easy, but it is one of the less difficult situations in which people have been lost. It is much worse to be lost in a heavily forested valley with just mountains on every side. That you're screwed that way. The point is that, much as with his little brother's disappearance so many years earlier, the way home should have been relatively clear, and yet he never made it back, nor have his remains ever been found. Dogs couldn't trace his scent, aircraft found no sign of him even when the weather was clear, and there wasn't a shred of evidence as to which direction he'd gone, even though there were really only two possible ways he could have traveled back towards the cabin. You'd expect somebody in Chuck's situation to follow the water downstream towards civilization. That's the common advice in these situations. It's not always the best advice, but it is the common advice. And he would do this either via one of the creeks in the area or by the riverside. But for some reason, he doesn't seem to have done that. Or he may have fallen into the river, but none of the reporting suggests that this was considered an option. Perhaps the biggest question of all, however, is the same one Charles Palmer asked about his youngest son a decade earlier. Why did his friends leave him behind? The reporting is split on precisely what happened that night. The group said that they saw him going the wrong direction as they were traveling back to the cabin, but if that were true, then why had they just continued back instead of chasing him down to correct his course? And what did they mean by the wrong direction? It doesn't make much sense. Chris, on the other hand, explicitly said that he thought the group was going too fast, and that Chuck simply fell behind due to his lack of experience and skill driving a snowmobile, which could explain why it took the rest of them so long to notice he was gone. If that were the case, though, how did he manage to lose track of the trail left by 3 other snowmobiles? How did he end up getting so turned around that he found himself going east, which would have been visibly the wrong direction, both because of the mountain and because he'd be going uphill instead of down? The only way it really makes sense is if the point of separation occurred on the east side of the mountain where the snowmobile was found, but that would contradict what the group said in a much more significant way than what Chris proposed. In addition, if Chuck had gotten stuck on the east side of the mountain, then it doesn't make sense to lie and say that it happened while they were on their way back. And if they knew he'd gotten stuck, why did they fail to find him that same night? They should have known exactly where he was. If it was as the group said, then their decision not to go after him when they noticed he was going the wrong way is inexplicable. If it's as Chris suggested, then the location in which the snowmobile was found makes no sense. And if the group was completely lying about when and where he disappeared and knew that he was on the east side, then why did it take until the following evening to find his snowmobile? The most sensible option would seem to be Chris's hypothesis, which just requires that his friends and stepfather lacked awareness and that Chuck made a mistake in the dark. But even then, it seems hard to imagine that he'd both get himself so completely turned around as to reach the river, and that he didn't have the presence of mind to either put himself in the most visible position possible, out in the open fields of snow, or to follow the river back to civilization. Once again, it really seems as though someone knows something and isn't speaking up, echoing the words of Ron Jones regarding Michael's disappearance. Of course everyone's not straightforward. Something did go wrong that they're not telling us. When you look at the two stories, they really are bafflingly similar. Both Palmer brothers were with a group of 3 other people, both were on their way home for the night, both were riding something, both were left behind by their companions, and in both cases, the evidence placed their last known location at or in a river. It would almost seem that the cases have to be connected, but how could they possibly be? Two brothers, 2 disappearances, and a laundry list of similarities. That is what the disappearances of Michael and Chuck Palmer have in common. On the other hand, the groups of people were completely different, the locations had little in common, and Chuck was much older and stronger than his younger brother. As unlikely as coincidences of this magnitude seem, it really is hard to find a way in which they could be connected in any meaningful way, unless you venture pretty deep into conspiracy territory. And even then you get to the point where you need to show evidence that what happened to Michael was indeed foul play. That part, however, I actually don't believe is quite as difficult to argue for. Going back to the events of Michael's disappearance, we know that they were riding in 2 pairs before the one riding with Michael sped up, and that this occurred near the intersection of Silver and Pittman in Wasilla. Incidentally, also the spot where one would turn right to head up another road towards the river. Then we're told that they rode a full 3 miles before stopping to wait for the friend they'd inexplicably left behind, and that they waited at a 7-Eleven on Park Highway for precisely 40 minutes. There's enough specific information in the story for it to sound true, but not really to explain the behavior of the boys involved. In my opinion, having looked at quite a few cases like this in my time, it feels like they did indeed tell the truth, or at least most of it. The one part they didn't explain was why they left him behind in the first place, despite giving a pretty clear-cut explanation of how that happened. Was it just a prank? That would make a lot of sense, and would track with the way 15-year-olds actually behave. Was there an argument that caused them to leave Michael behind suddenly? It wouldn't be the first time that a few slightly inebriated teenagers fought over something stupid and made rash decisions as a result. The problem with either of those options is that neither of them explain how Michael's bike ended up in the river, and how his shoes ended up on an airstrip north of it. If they left him behind because of an argument or just as a joke, then he should have either turned up at Dustin and Tommy's house or at his own. But instead, he ended up vanishing completely and leaving evidence that he'd gone in entirely the wrong direction. Now, Michael's father never bought the story that the boys told police, and to be honest, I don't know that I do either. But why would they lie? It's definitely possible that they all got into a fight and Michael ended up dead as a result, but then what happened to his body? The simple answer would be to throw him in the river and hope that he was washed away, but then he'd have been caught on one of the several log jams downstream. And then there's the bike and the shoes. While they might have thought that placing the bike in the river would imply to the authorities that he'd drowned, the shoes on the airstrip would give the opposite impression. So why place them there if the goal was to make it seem like Michael rode into the river and drowned? If the boys had been a year or two older and had access to a car, then you could argue that it was a red herring to keep police occupied on the river and the airstrip, and that they just buried or dumped the body elsewhere, but they were 15, and they were on bikes. As convenient as foul play on the part of Dustin, Tommy, and Cameron would be, there's just no good way of explaining how they could have pulled it off to that degree of success. There is another possibility involving foul play, though, which doesn't require explaining how Michael's friends harmed him and got away with it. If we assume that their story is mostly true, then the part that sticks out the most is the point of separation. There was no explanation for why one of the boys decided to suddenly ride ahead, or why they didn't stop to wait or turn around to make sure Michael was still following them. But there could be. These were 3 freshman boys at a graduation party for one of the neighborhood's seniors. Freshman boys can be annoying, and seniors can drive. So could it be possible that Michael and his friends pissed off the wrong guy at one of these parties, left, and then were followed by an older teenager in a car? If so, it could be the reason that the boys weren't able to explain why they left Michael behind and didn't stop to wait for him until they reached a well-lit convenience store on the highway 3 miles away. You know, maybe as they were being chased down Pittman and as they reached the corner of Pittman and Silver, Dustin, Tommy, and Cameron turned south and Michael turned north. Maybe his pursuers went after the prey that broke off from the group. Maybe Michael tried to ride across the river and got stuck. Maybe he jumped off the bike and then ran towards the airfield, and maybe they caught up with him, beat him a little too hard, and left his shoes behind to confuse police while they dumped the body somewhere outside of the search area. And maybe Dustin, Tommy, and Cameron were too scared of what might happen if they spoke up. That's one of a few different possible explanations for what happened to Michael Palmer that night, and in my opinion, one of the more likely. It's certainly possible that his friends were responsible in some way, I just don't see it as very plausible. The same can be said of more supernatural explanations, given how Michael seems to have simply vanished into thin air after leaving his shoes on an airstrip. But as I've said for years, you must eliminate the mundane before considering the paranormal. And in Michael's case, there is a very plausible mundane answer, as convoluted as it might be. But eliminating the mundane isn't quite so easy in the case of Chuck Palmer, mostly because there was absolutely no evidence of foul play, and because he absolutely should have been found somewhere along the river if he went missing where the sources say he did. The only reason I can think of to suspect foul play, and a connection with Michael's disappearance, is if he had somehow discovered that one of his companions was involved in whatever happened in 1999. Even if that were the case, though, would the other riders have gone along with it? And more importantly, would his stepfather? There's no indication that the 3 of them told different stories or that they contradicted each other in any way, and doing something to Chuck would have to have been pretty spur of the moment since Chris was supposed to be along that day too. It just doesn't seem plausible. And I also found no evidence that anyone would have benefited from Chuck's death, so it's hard to come up with a rational explanation for a motive. In the end, as unbelievable as it is, any perceived connection here really does seem to be the result of a bizarre, tragic coincidence. Yet, at the same time, neither case is well explained by accident, making for a genuinely strange situation in which 2 brothers went missing in very similar, yet unconnected and totally unexplained circumstances. Like I said, I think that foul play does make the most sense in Michael's case, but they were never able to find the evidence for it, and I'm genuinely at a loss for Chuck, because it's possible that he did just make some really bad choices and wander off into the woods, and that he's never going to be found, but I just can't imagine not taking the obvious choice of following the river. But if you guys have any other ideas, or if you perhaps knew one of these people, or I missed some information, please let me know down in the comments, and I will take a look, and if I end up talking about this story in the future, I will adjust things. With all that said, if you do want to support what we do here at the Lore Lodge, you can like, subscribe, share the video. Those are actually the most efficient ways of doing it, but you can also subscribe on Patreon for just $1 a month, We are putting up scripts starting very soon. We'll be uploading ad-free episodes of this show. We're shooting for October on that. And there's also some other little, fun exclusive goodies in there. You can also drink our beans. And you can do that by going to Tableau Roasting Company and buying our coffee, Mount Pocono Perk, that we have a collaboration with, actually, with Stakuyi, History of Everything, with whom we do History Unhinged. And as I say that, let me transition into the fact that we have other shows. We have History Unhinged, we have the Weird Bible. There's some new stuff coming to Weird Bible. I've already booked 2 guests for one of the new shows. And then I have my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, where in the next few months we'll probably be streaming a lot of Battlefield and a lot of Helldivers, and I'm going to try to get back to doing some commentary streams, because to be honest, it's getting hard to find topics to cover. So I'm going to use that as an opportunity to go find new cases, take your recommendations, and steal other people's cases. But by that, I mean, just do them more. I mean, there's a finite number of missing people out there. We're all gonna dip into the same pool at some point. Now, if you would like to wear our skin, you can feel as though you're doing so by going to Bunker Branding and purchasing from their Lore Lodge collection. We have a number of designs, and we're gonna bring you more eventually. As always, the best place to get updates on what we're up to, interact with us, and interact with the general community here is to join our Discord at bit.ly/jointhelodge, and all of these links are down in the description, nice and easy for you. Last but not least, we do have our live show, The Lore Lads, which is Monday nights at 7 p.m., unless it's not, and if you're catching this video on the day it came out, then, it wasn't the past month or so, but that's because we were in Montana, and now we're not. So the show must go on. And if you can't catch the show live here on YouTube, it's always up as an on-demand video. And of course, you can catch it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, 2 days after it goes live here. So that's Wednesday mornings. And of course, thank you to Delete Me for sponsoring this video and so many of our others over the years. With all that said, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.